Hello, my name is Luis Robles and I'm a PhD candidate in history in Belgium. Today I'm going to talk to you about two unusual maps, two Ottoman portolan charts that have full grids of parallels and meridians drawn on them. We'll see that both these charts were different attempts to solve a long-standing problem, how to reconcile traditional nautical charting with Ptolemaic cartography. The first of these charts was sold in 2009 at Christie's and has not been seen since then. It is a large and signed map of the Mediterranean drawn on paper. Toponyms are written in Ottoman Turkish. The second chart is preserved at the Silvia Ioannou Foundation in Cyprus. It is another unsigned Ottoman map of the Mediterranean drawn on paper. The two charts are shown here at the same scale. They have practically the same size and the same geographical scope. Both have been dated to the 17th century based on style and materials. Both maps have many of the features of traditional nautical charts or portolan charts, such as a network of rhumb lines, a clear focus on coastal geography, and the writing of toponyms roughly perpendicular to coastlines and on the land side. It is believed that authors of portolan charts tended to copy coastal profiles from one work to another. The two Ottoman maps studied here are one example of that practice, as their coastal profiles practically overlap in most regions. In both charts, rhumb lines emanate from a single central windrose located in the same place, and form the same angle with the edges of the map. In addition, the great majority of toponyms are written in the same places in both charts. The two charts are not identical, though. Discrepancies can be found, for example, along the Adriatic coast. This rules out mechanical copying from one to the other. Furthermore, the artistic styles of the two artifacts are very different, as can be seen by comparing their windroses or the outline of Cyprus. These two artifacts are typical portolan charts in many aspects, but they are also atypical, because they are very large and because they were drawn on paper instead of parchment. But their most unusual feature is the grid of parallels and meridians that crisscrosses each of them. While medieval portolan charts of the Mediterranean were alien to the concepts of latitude and longitude, by the 17th century it had become relatively common for map makers to add scales of latitude to their nautical charts. It is, however, extremely unusual to find indications of cartographic longitude on Mediterranean nautical charts. This is why I have set out to understand how the grids of these two charts were drawn, by whom, and for what purpose. The chart sold at Christie's contains a dense grid of latitude and longitude, with 14 parallels and 54 meridians. Parallels are drawn as straight lines parallel to the horizontal edges of the map, evenly spaced from north to south, and meridians are straight too, and quite evenly spaced. They form an angle with the vertical edges that varies from 9 degrees in the west to around 15 at the eastern edge. Several meridians are numbered along the top edge of the map, but I can only make out a few numbers at the northeast corner. These longitudes are written in Eastern Arabic numerals, which I have translated to our Western Arabic numerals. I have now highlighted the main rhumb lines of the chart. It can be seen that neither parallels nor meridians are aligned with them. This is quite surprising because it means there is an internal contradiction in the map. Parallels are supposed to be east-west lines, but they are drawn here with a different orientation than east-west rhombs. The orientation of meridians is more accurate than that of parallels, and their varying inclination implies that the person who plotted them believed that magnetic declination is not homogeneous. The spacing of these meridians implies that the longitude of the Mediterranean Sea is overestimated by around 8 degrees, an error of around 21%. This numerical result is important, and I will come back to it later. Moving now to the Ioannou chart, I have represented it here, highlighting its parallels and meridians. There are fewer of them than on the Christie's chart, but their tracing is more sophisticated. Values of latitudes and longitudes were written for each parallel and meridian. In addition, every meridian was graduated by indicating latitude values. An oddity is a graduated red line that runs north-south between meridians 25 and 30. I will ignore it by now and come back to it in a few minutes. The graduation of each meridian is consistent with the position of parallels, but it does not seem aligned with that of the other meridians. The result is that if one plots intermediate parallels based on these degrees of latitude, they are not smooth curves, but broken lines. This is particularly visible in the central Mediterranean, between Tunisia, Libya, and Sicily. Here I have compared the orientation of parallels and meridians with that of the rhomb line network. Like in the Christie's chart, we can see that orientations are different. For this chart, I have been able to compare the latitudes and longitudes given by parallels and meridians with the actual coordinates of 57 Mediterranean localities. In the Christie's chart, I was not able to do it because I could not really read the toponyms. So in the Joannou chart, parallels turn out to be quite accurately located with respect to depicted cities and islands. Latitude errors are less than 1 degree everywhere, except in the region near Istanbul. This is another unexpected finding, because one would tend to think that Ottoman map makers would know the latitude of their capital well. Moving on to longitudes, meridians are drawn quite precisely, meaning that each individual meridian connects places that truly lie at similar longitudes. However, the meridians drawn on this chart are not accurately located. I have superimposed in orange the places at which meridians should have been drawn to be consistent with the geography of the chart. One can see that in the west the discrepancy is quite small, but at the eastern end of the Mediterranean the longitude error is rather large, 37% on average. Overall, the positions of the meridians on the Joannou chart would imply that the Mediterranean is 8 degrees too long. This is the same value that we found earlier for the Christie's chart. Nevertheless, one important difference with the Christie's chart is the geographical distribution of the longitude error. In this Joannou chart, the error is concentrated in the east. This error signature is very characteristic and has allowed me to pinpoint the likely source of its meridians. In the Joannou chart, meridians and parallels seem to have been drawn after the color fill of the coastlines, as can be seen here. This suggests that the grid was copied from some other source. I have compared the error of its Mediterranean longitude with those of a large corpus of cartographic works to identify some candidates that could have been the source used by the Ottoman map maker. I have then inspected those candidates to check 2 points. First, is their error concentrated in the eastern Mediterranean, like in the Joannou chart? And second, do absolute longitudes match, meaning that the same reference meridian was used? The result of this study is that the Joannou chart's grid is most similar to that of a monumental world map published by Johan Blauw in Amsterdam in 1648. The spacing of meridians is identical, as well as their absolute values. The only innovation in the Ottoman chart is the addition of a meridian at 25 degrees. Regarding latitudes, Blauw's map significantly overestimates the latitude of Istanbul, as is also the case of the Joannou chart. Blauw's world map became an influential model in the second half of the 17th century. It was published again in Amsterdam in an amended and somewhat reduced form, reproduced here. Other versions were produced in Italy. It is quite plausible that an Ottoman map maker of the 1680s could have access to a copy of at least one of these works. I could now move on to discuss how the Joannou chart was drawn and why, but let me first go back to that odd red line that I mentioned before. The red line is straight and runs parallel to north-south rhomb lines. Its orientation is therefore inconsistent with that of the meridians highlighted in blue here. The numbers along the red double line form a latitude scale that is also inconsistent with that of the meridians and does not even match the position of parallel 40-degree north. This awkward element thus seems to be at odds with the rest of the map. Nevertheless, the latitudes written along the red double line are accurate at its southern end. The line crosses the coastline of the Iberian Peninsula at Cartagena and the coastline of North Africa at Mers el-Kebir. These two cities actually lie at almost the same longitude, so the orientation of the red line is correct if it is meant to represent a meridian. In addition, the latitudes of both cities match the numbers written along the red double line very accurately, to within less than half a degree. I think it is not a coincidence that Cartagena and Mers el-Kebir are the two best natural ports of the Western Mediterranean, and at the time both were bases of the Spanish Navy, the traditional rival of the Ottoman fleet in the Mediterranean. If Ottoman naval officers had tables of coordinates at their disposal, these two enemy ports must have featured prominently on them. It seems that the rest of the latitude scale of the red line was extrapolated from these two correct values. By doing so, however, the map maker reached latitude 50 degrees north, and at this point he must have realized that there was something wrong. We can now wrap up and build on all these findings to venture hypotheses about who drew this chart, how, and why. The authors of the Christie's chart must have drawn the coastal profiles and rhomb lines first, probably copying from some earlier model. They then added parallels as horizontal lines and meridians as diagonal lines. Perhaps they spaced the parallels looking at some portolan chart with a latitude scale drawn on it, such as this one made in Livorno around the same years. Our Ottoman authors, however, did not realize that for their chart, those latitudes were valid only along the western edge. They were apparently ignorant of the issue of the tilt of the Mediterranean and how it had already been corrected by Western map makers. Regarding meridians, the 21% error in the longitude of the Mediterranean suggests that the position of the meridians was influenced by contemporary West European conceptions, but I have not found a possible source. The process followed for the Ioannou chart was initially the same: reproduce coastlines, toponyms, and rhomb lines from some older archetype, but then the authors followed a much different method to add meridians and parallels. In a first attempt, they tried to be consistent with the rhomb lines and with the geographical information contained in the chart. This resulted in the red line I just explained and the quick realization that something was wrong. They then came up with the idea of copying the entire grid of parallels and meridians from a printed Western world map that was deemed highly reliable at the time. They thus transferred the positions of 2 parallels and 5 meridians from the printed map onto the chart. They then took out a table of latitudes and used it to graduate each meridian separately. By copying this grid, the Ottoman map makers unknowingly transferred to their chart the misconception held by Dutch cartographers about the longitude of the Eastern Mediterranean, a region that paradoxically had always been depicted with accurate proportions by the portolan chart tradition. Finally, who drew these latitude-longitude grids and why? A clue is that the latitudes and longitudes written on the 2 charts are all in very small script. They can only be read from close. This means that these numbers were not intended for public contemplation or for teaching in a large classroom. They were useful only for the person who wrote them or for someone who would consult the map in detail. To me, this evokes someone working within a limited circle of specialists, perhaps a military map maker or a scholar. The Ottoman workshop that made these 2 charts was one of the few still keeping alive the old Mediterranean tradition of nautical cartography. The market was being taken over by printed maps and atlases, mostly based on latitudes and longitudes and published in Northwest Europe. This Northwest European cartography was at the time an object of study for several Ottoman intellectuals. In particular, Khatib Çelebi and Ad Dimashqi translated key Dutch atlases. This was no revolution, however, because the concepts of Ptolemaic cartography were far from novel in Ottoman lands, and Çelebi's and Ad Dimashqi's maps were drawn without much regard for meridians and parallels. It would be mistaken to imagine Ottoman map makers of the 17th century as ignorant people stuck in the practices of traditional portolan charting, waiting to be illuminated by Dutch cartographers on the use of latitude and longitude. The concepts of Ptolemaic cartography were probably as well understood in Istanbul as in Livorno or in Amsterdam, but many map makers in those cities just kept on opting for portolan-style techniques to draw their nautical charts. What was challenging was how to blend the teachings of the two schools. Enrique Letao has shown how the relationship between nautical and Ptolemaic map makers in 16th century Europe was dominated by conceptual clashes about how maps should be made, and by mutual misunderstandings of how the maps of the other school should be interpreted and how erroneous or useless they were. Overall, it seems that not a single cartographer was able to develop a satisfactory method to convert nautical charts into Ptolemaic maps with meridians and parallels, or vice versa. The grids on these two Ottoman charts stand out as practical experiments to blend a traditional portolan chart with the astronomical mathematical cartography of Ptolemaic inspiration. The authors of these documents made 3 attempts overall. One of those attempts, the red double line of the Ioannou chart, was quickly discarded by its own author. Another approach, that of the Christie's chart, could have been identified as blatantly erroneous by anyone with a table of latitudes at hand. Finally, the grid drawn on the Ioannou chart in black ink gave a result that would have been considered satisfactory according to the standards of the time, given the uncertainty about the actual longitude of the Mediterranean. In this way, by trial and error, Ottoman map makers at last succeeded at reconciling portolan charting with Ptolemaic cartography, at least apparently. Thank you for your attention.